Daniel pushed branches out of his way as he moved deeper into the alien jungle. Every step made a strange sound, the ground soft and full of hidden roots. Bright insects glowed in the shadows, and the air was heavy, almost too thick to breathe. He had been walking for hours, lost after his ship's signal device broke. His clothes were torn, his arms scratched, and his throat dry. But he kept moving, because standing still meant death. The jungle was alive. It was not just trees and vines. It felt like something was always watching him. He stopped when he heard the sound, soft, too soft for a beast. It was the sound of careful footsteps, light and cautious. His hand went to his knife, the only weapon he had left. He turned slowly, scanning the trees. For a moment, he saw nothing but leaves moving in the wind. Then, between the thick vines, a pair of glowing eyes appeared. Daniel froze. His heart thumped hard. At first, he thought it was an animal, some predator with strange eyes. But then the figure stepped out. It was not an animal. It was a girl. Her skin was pale with a faint shimmer under the moonlight that managed to cut through the jungle canopy. Her hair was wild, tangled with twigs and leaves. And she wore nothing. Not a single cloth covered her body, only dirt and pieces of leaves clinging to her. She looked fragile, almost starving, but her eyes burned with life. Daniel slowly raised both his hands, showing he carried no threat. The girl tilted her head, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. She did not speak. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she sniffed the air, like an animal testing if he was safe. He tried to say something simple. "I mean no harm." His voice was soft, almost a whisper. The girl blinked, but gave no sign of understanding. For a moment, the two stood in silence. The jungle around them was not silent, though. Strange cries echoed far away, the cries of night creatures hunting. The girl suddenly flinched, her ears twitching like she heard something he could not. She stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the ground, and then stopped just a few steps away. Her body trembled, but not from cold. She was afraid, yet curious. Daniel slowly reached into his survival pack and pulled out a food bar. He held it in front of him, not moving closer. The girl's eyes locked on the food, and for the first time, he saw the hunger in her. She hesitated, her breathing sharp, then took one small step, then another. Her hand, thin and shaking, reached out and snatched the bar from his palm. She tore the wrapper with her teeth and devoured it like someone who had not eaten for days. Daniel watched, his chest tight. She was more than just lost. She was surviving. When the food was gone, she looked at him again. This time, her eyes were different. Less fear, more interest. She made a sound, a soft hum like testing her voice, but still no words. Then she lifted her hand and pointed at him, then at the ground behind him. Daniel turned, confused. At first, he thought she was pointing at his camp. But then the sound came. Low at first, then louder. A growl, deep and heavy. The ground seemed to vibrate. Daniel's skin went cold. He gripped his knife, though he knew it was useless against something that made a sound like that. The girl's eyes widened, and she shook her head. She pointed again, more urgently, then grabbed his arm with surprising strength. Her hand was warm and trembling, her nails pressing into his skin. She tugged him hard, trying to pull him away from the path he had come. Daniel hesitated for only a second. Then he followed her. She led him off the trail, pushing through vines, running barefoot as if she knew every hidden root and stone. Daniel stumbled, nearly falling, but she never slowed. Her hair whipped in the air, her breath fast, but her grip on him never loosened. Behind them, the growl rose again, and branches cracked as if something huge was moving closer. Finally, they reached a thick wall of vines covering the side of a hill. Without stopping, the girl slipped between them, dragging Daniel with her. He fell into darkness, into a cave hidden from the outside. His chest heaved as he caught his breath. The girl crouched low, listening. Outside, the ground shook again, and the air filled with the heavy breathing of a beast. Daniel pressed his back to the cave wall, gripping his knife tightly, sweat running down his face. The sound outside grew closer, then paused. For a moment, he was sure it would find them. But then the noise drifted away, the heavy steps moving farther into the jungle. Only when silence returned did the girl finally let go of his arm. She sat down on the stone floor, her thin chest rising and falling, her eyes still glowing faintly in the dark. Daniel looked at her, realizing the truth. She was not just a wild girl. She had survived in this jungle, alone, without clothes, without food, with only fear and instinct keeping her alive. But now, for some reason, she had chosen not to run from him. She had chosen to save him. And as her glowing eyes fixed on him again, he understood something important. His life was now tied to hers, and the jungle was far more dangerous than he ever imagined. Daniel sat quietly inside the cave, his chest still rising and falling after the run. The alien girl sat across from him, staring without blinking. The silence was heavy, broken only by drops of water falling from the rocks above. Her glowing eyes studied him, unafraid now, only curious. Daniel reached into his pack again, slowly, and pulled out another food bar. He placed it on the ground between them, careful not to move too close. The girl tilted her head, her tangled hair falling over her face. After a moment, she reached out, snatched the food, and ate quickly, like she had done before. When she finished, she licked the wrapper clean. Daniel smiled faintly. "Hungry, huh?" he whispered, though he knew she did not understand. But the girl's gaze softened a little. She made a soft sound in her throat, something between a hum and a word, but still too strange for him to understand. He tapped his chest gently. "Daniel," he said, pointing at himself. Then he waited. The girl blinked, confused at first, but then she copied him. She tapped her own chest lightly, but no sound came. Her lips moved, struggling to form something. Finally, a broken whisper slipped out, more breath than word. It sounded like Lyra. Daniel nodded. "Lyra," he repeated. For the first time, her lips curved into a small smile. It was shy, almost hidden, but it was there. Then suddenly, she grew tense again, her head turned toward the cave entrance, her ears twitching like an animal's. Daniel heard nothing at first, but then he noticed it too, the faint echo of voices outside, not animal sounds, but people. The girl's entire body stiffened. She rose quickly, her hand gripping his arm again. Without a word, she pulled him deeper into the cave, away from the light of the entrance. They moved through the darkness until the walls opened into a wider chamber. The air smelled of smoke and ash. On the stone walls, Daniel saw marks, carved symbols, and drawings that glowed faintly in the dark. He touched one with his fingers. They were old, very old. The girl stopped and pointed at the carvings. One image showed her people standing tall and free, but another showed chains around their arms and necks. The next image showed cages, and then whips. Daniel's chest tightened. He turned to her. "This is your people?" he asked softly, though she could not understand the words. The girl pointed at the drawing of chains, then at herself. She shook her head violently, her hair flying around her face. Her glowing eyes filled with a silent fire. Daniel understood enough. She had escaped. She did not want to be caged. The jungle was her prison, but it was also her freedom. She survived there rather than return to the chains. His throat felt tight as he looked at her. She was young, far too young to be living like this. Then a sound came from outside again. This time it was louder. Boots crunching leaves, voices calling in a harsh alien tongue. Lyra flinched, her eyes wide with panic. She grabbed Daniel's hand, pulling him further into the tunnels. He followed quickly, his boots slipping on the wet stone. The voices grew closer, echoing through the cave mouth. Shadows moved near the entrance, flickers of torchlight cutting through the dark. Whoever they were searching. Lyra pulled Daniel into a narrow passage that twisted downward. The space was so tight that he had to crouch and squeeze his shoulders against the rock. She moved like water, silent and sure, her bare feet never making a sound. He could hear her breath, fast but controlled, and feel her fingers digging into his wrist as if afraid to let him go. The farther they went, the colder the air became. The walls were damp, and strange insects crawled across the stone, glowing faintly like little stars. Finally, they came out into a hidden chamber, where a pool of water reflected the dim glow of the insects. Lyra knelt beside the water and drank quickly, splashing it against her face. Daniel crouched beside her, filling his hands with water to wash his mouth. For a moment, they rested there, breathing hard, the danger behind them but never gone. Lyra looked at him then, her eyes softer now, almost questioning. She lifted her hand, touched his chest lightly, and whispered something he almost recognized. The sound was broken, but he thought she said safe. Daniel's eyes widened. She had learned the word from him earlier. He nodded, his voice steady. Safe. He pointed at her, then at himself, repeating the word. Her lips trembled, but she nodded. Suddenly, a roar echoed from the jungle outside, so deep it made the water in the pool ripple. Daniel stiffened, but Lyra did not move. She closed her eyes, listening. Her hand tightened around his wrist again. She knew the jungle better than anyone, and her face showed the truth. Whatever was out there was not just a hunter. It was something worse. Daniel's heart raced. He realized then that he was not just lost anymore. He was caught in her fight for survival. This girl, naked and wild, was more than just a strange creature of the jungle. She carried a story of chains, escape, and silent defiance. And now, by saving him, she had tied his life to hers. As the roars and voices faded into the distance, the two sat in silence by the glowing pool. Lyra's eyes stayed on him, searching, questioning if he would abandon her like the rest. Daniel looked back at her and shook his head slowly. "I won't leave you," he whispered, even though she might not understand the words. But she seemed to feel the meaning. For the first time, she reached out her hand, not to drag him, not in fear, but simply to hold it. Daniel closed his fingers around hers. In that dark cave, surrounded by the sounds of the wild jungle and enemies searching outside, a fragile bond was formed, one that neither chains nor beasts could break. The cave was quiet, only the sound of dripping water echoing through the stone. Daniel sat close to the pool, still catching his breath, while Lyra crouched near the entrance of the narrow passage, her glowing eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. She looked tense, like an animal waiting for danger. Daniel felt the weight of the silence pressing on him. His hand rested on his knife, though deep inside he knew it was useless against most of the threats in this jungle. Then it began. The first sound was a low rumble, faint but heavy, like thunder trapped under the ground. Daniel frowned, thinking maybe it was just his imagination, but the look on Lyra's face told him it was real. Her body went rigid, her eyes wide with fear. She pressed a finger against her lips, warning him not to make a sound. The rumble grew louder, shaking tiny bits of dust from the cave's ceiling. Daniel felt the vibration through the stone floor. It was moving closer. Branches outside cracked, and trees groaned as if something massive pushed its way through. The noise was not like the footsteps of soldiers. This was deeper, heavier, a beast that the jungle itself seemed afraid of. Lyra's breathing quickened. She turned to Daniel suddenly, grabbing his wrist with both hands, her nails digging into his skin. Her lips formed a single word, one she had learned from him. Run. The next moment, the ground shook with a roar so loud it made Daniel's ears ring. The sound rolled into the cave, bouncing off the walls. He felt his chest vibrate, his heart pounding in fear. He had heard predators before, but nothing like this. Lyra yanked his arm and pulled him toward the passage that led outside. Daniel stumbled after her, his boots sliding on the wet stone. They burst through the curtain of vines back into the night. The air was thick with the smell of wet leaves and something stronger, like rot mixed with blood. The jungle was alive with noise, smaller creatures fleeing in all directions. Birds exploded from the trees above, screeching wildly as they fled into the darkness. And then he saw it. The beast came crashing through the undergrowth, its body covered in dark, bony plates that reflected the dim glow of the alien moon. It was taller than any animal Daniel had ever seen. Its massive jaws filled with sharp teeth that glistened with drool. Its eyes glowed faintly, like hot coals buried in its skull, and every step it took sent a shiver through the ground. It roared again, a sound that made Daniel's stomach twist. Daniel's knife felt like a toy in his hand. He knew he could not fight this thing. His mind raced. There was only one choice: escape. Lyra pulled him hard, dragging him toward the river that ran not far from the cave. They crashed through vines and stumbled over roots. The beast followed, tearing through trees as if they were nothing. Daniel dared a glance back and saw its huge jaws snap down on a trunk, splitting it in two like dry wood. They reached the riverbank, the moonlight shimmering across the rushing water. Lyra did not hesitate. She leapt into the current and pulled Daniel in with her. The water was icy and strong, wrapping around him, dragging him away from the bank. His lungs filled with panic as the current sucked him under. He kicked hard, breaking the surface, gasping for air. Beside him, Lyra swam like she had done it 1,000 times, her small hands gripping his sleeve to keep him steady. Behind them, the beast stomped onto the river's edge, its massive claws sinking into the mud. It lowered its head, snapping at the water, sending waves crashing toward them. Daniel felt the spray hit his face as he kicked harder, letting the current pull him faster downstream. The beast roared in frustration and charged along the riverbank, trying to keep up. The current twisted and spun them, carrying them over rocks. Daniel's arms burned as he tried to stay above water. Lyra clung tightly to him, her glowing eyes locked on his. Even in the chaos, she looked determined, refusing to let him drown. The beast followed for a long stretch, its heavy body crashing through the jungle beside the river. Every time Daniel thought they had lost it, another roar would shake the trees. Finally, the river narrowed and quickened, pulling them into a deep channel where the beast could no longer follow. They were thrown against rocks, scraped and battered by the rushing water. Daniel coughed and choked, but forced himself to keep moving. His chest burned, his arms weak, but still he fought to stay alive. At last, the river spat them out onto a small bank. Daniel crawled onto the mud, gasping, water dripping from his hair and clothes. Lyra pulled herself beside him, coughing hard but alive. For a long moment, they both lay there, their bodies shaking from exhaustion. The jungle around them was quiet now, only the sound of the river rushing behind them. Daniel rolled onto his back, staring at the alien stars above. His heart still thundered in his chest, but he was alive. Slowly, he turned his head to look at Lyra. She was sitting up now, her hair clinging wet to her face, her glowing eyes still wide from the chase. She looked at him, her lips parting, and then she whispered a single word. Safe. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. That word again. She had learned it from him, and now she used it for the second time. Her voice was weak, but her eyes shone with something stronger than fear. Trust. She trusted him. Daniel pushed himself up, sitting beside her. His knife was gone, lost to the river, but for the first time, he did not care. He looked at the girl who had pulled him into the water, who had kept him alive in a world that wanted to kill him at every step. He felt something shift inside him. He was no longer just a lost human in a strange jungle. He was a protector now. Her protector. The night air was cold, their clothes soaked, but Daniel hardly noticed. The bond between them was growing, forged in fear and survival. And as the jungle fell silent again, one thought repeated in his mind. This was only the beginning of what awaited them. The morning sun filtered weakly through the alien jungle, its light falling across Daniel and Lyra as they sat on the riverbank, drying their soaked clothes. Daniel's body ached from the struggle in the water, but his mind was sharper than ever. He could not stay here. The jungle was too dangerous, filled with beasts that even a single mistake could unleash upon them. And now he knew Lyra's truth. She had escaped chains. She had lived unclothed like an animal because it was safer than being taken back to her captors. If he wanted to save her, he had to take her out of this place. Daniel stood and looked down the winding river. Somewhere beyond the jungle, he remembered, there was a border city. Traders came and went there. If they could reach it, they might find food, clothes, and a safe path forward. He turned to Lyra. She was crouched in the mud, staring at him with questioning eyes. He pointed to the distance, then to himself and her. We go, he said simply. She tilted her head, not understanding the words, but when he began walking, she rose quickly and followed. Their journey was slow. The jungle resisted every step with its thick vines and swampy ground. Daniel used his knife to cut paths, though it had grown dull. Lyra moved lightly beside him, silent as always, sometimes slipping ahead to scout the way. She was born to these shadows, but now she stayed near him, as if she had already chosen not to survive alone anymore. By evening, the trees thinned, the ground hardened beneath their feet. In the distance, lights shimmered, bright, unnatural lights that cut through the dusk. Daniel felt a strange relief, civilization. But as they drew closer, Lyra grew restless. She tugged at his arm, her face worried. Her glowing eyes darted nervously at the lights, as though she remembered something painful. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder and nodded. It's all right, he said softly. She did not understand his words, but his calmness made her hesitate less. Together, they stepped out of the jungle and onto a rough road that led to the border city. The city was alive with noise, shouts in alien tongues, the clatter of carts, the smell of smoke and cooked meat filled the air. Strange creatures with scales, horns, or extra limbs filled the crowded streets. Daniel walked carefully, his eyes scanning everything. Lyra pressed close to him, her body tense, her eyes wide at the chaos. She was used to silence, to shadows and trees. Here, the crowd swallowed her, eyes turning toward her with every step. And then Daniel noticed it too. Whispers, people pointing, heads turning, not at him, but at her. Lyra's bare skin, her wild hair, the dirt and scars on her body, she stood out like a flame in the dark. Traitors sneered. A group of alien women laughed, covering their mouths, whispering words Daniel couldn't catch. But the worst were the men. Some looked at her with hunger, others with cruel recognition, as if they had seen girls like her before. Daniel clenched his fists. He guided Lyra quickly off the main road, trying to escape the stairs, but his eyes caught something that froze his blood. Along a wide street stood rows of cages, built of thick bars. Inside them were alien girls, young, thin, dressed in rags or nothing at all. Their eyes were empty, some full of tears, others dull with hopelessness. Men shouted prices, calling them property. Lyra stopped walking, her entire body stiff. She stared at the cages, her glowing eyes reflecting terror. Her hand rose unconsciously to her chest, trembling. Daniel understood. This was what she had escaped from. He turned her away quickly, shielding her from the sight, but her trembling did not stop. She clung to his arm like a child, her body shaking. Daniel swallowed the fire of anger burning in him. He wanted to tear those cages down, but he knew he couldn't fight an entire city. Not yet. He had to be smart. He had to think of her first. They pushed deeper into the streets until they found a quieter area. A shop stood there, filled with clothes hung on wooden stands, fabrics of all colors flowing like water in the dim lamplight. Daniel guided Lyra inside. The shopkeeper, a squat alien with 3 eyes, looked up from his counter. His gaze fell on Lyra, and his lips curled into a cruel grin. "Wild thing," he chuckled in his tongue, shaking his head. "You bring one from the cages, human?" Daniel's jaw tightened, but he forced a calm expression. He pulled a small coin pouch from his pack, dropping it on the counter. The alien's eyes widened at the sight of real credits. "Clothes," Daniel said firmly, pointing at the racks. The shopkeeper laughed but nodded, waving toward the shelves. Lyra stood frozen at the doorway, her eyes darting nervously. Daniel walked to her and gently took her hand. He pulled her toward a simple dress, soft fabric in pale color. He held it up against her, smiling gently, trying to show her it was safe. She blinked, confused, then touched the fabric with her fingers. It was smooth, unlike anything she had known in the jungle. Slowly, she allowed Daniel to guide her behind a curtain. He helped her understand how to wear the dress, careful not to frighten her. When she finally stepped out, the shop grew quiet. The dirt was still on her skin, her hair still tangled, but the dress transformed her. She no longer looked like a wild creature of the forest. She looked like a girl, young, vulnerable, but alive. For the first time, she saw herself in a mirror that hung on the wall. Her glowing eyes widened as she stared at her reflection. She raised a hand, touching the glass, as if unsure that the figure she saw was real. Then, slowly, her lips curved into a shy smile. Daniel felt his chest tighten. She looked almost human now. But outside, he caught sight of shadows moving, men watching through the window, their eyes fixed on her. Their whispers carried into the shop, words about taking her back, about her value in the cages. Daniel's hand moved instinctively toward his side, where his knife had once been before the river took it. His jaw clenched. He knew danger had only followed them here, and this city was far from safe. Lyra turned from the mirror to look at him, her smile fading when she saw the tension in his eyes. She stepped closer, her hand gripping his tightly, her glowing eyes full of silent questions. Daniel squeezed her hand back, his heart heavy but firm. He had promised her safety, and no matter what the city held for them, he would not let her go back to chains. The shopkeeper's laughter still echoed in Daniel's ears as he guided Lyra through the rows of fabric. She clutched his hand tightly, her glowing eyes darting from side to side, suspicious of every sound and movement. The moment she had stepped into the city, she had been overwhelmed. Here in the shop, the walls and the dim lamps gave a little comfort, but Daniel could feel the weight of danger pressing in on them. The men outside had been watching. He knew what they wanted. Daniel picked a simple dress, one that was long enough to cover her body and plain enough not to attract more attention. The shopkeeper snorted. "Why dress the wild thing? You waste credits, human. She belongs in the cages where she came from." Daniel's eyes hardened, but he said nothing. He only placed more credits on the counter and guided Lyra behind the curtain. She hesitated at first, unsure of what he wanted. She tugged at the fabric, her face filled with confusion. Daniel turned his back, giving her space, but showed her slowly how to slip her arms through the sleeves and how the cloth wrapped around her body. She copied him clumsily, her thin fingers trembling as she tried to pull the fabric into place. When she finally stepped out, Daniel felt his breath catch. The girl who had walked out of the jungle, bare and wild, now stood in front of him, wearing a pale dress that clung softly to her frame. Her hair was still tangled, and her skin still carried the dirt of survival. But something had changed. She no longer looked like prey. She looked like someone who had been given dignity. She saw herself in the mirror again, and her lips parted in wonder. Her fingers brushed the fabric, then touched the reflection of her face. For the first time since Daniel had met her, she looked almost free. But the silence in the shop was broken by low voices. Daniel's ears picked up the mutters from the doorway. A group of men had entered, their eyes fixed on Lyra. Their clothes were dark, their faces cruel with the sharp look of hunters. One of them smirked and spoke in the local tongue. Daniel did not understand the words, but the meaning was clear. They were talking about her, about taking her. Lyra noticed too. Her smile faded instantly. She stepped closer to Daniel, her hand gripping his arm, her body trembling. Her glowing eyes flicked to the men, then back to him, full of fear. Daniel's chest tightened. He had seen this before, in too many places. Men who thought they could own lives, who thought girls were nothing more than property to be bought and sold. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. The men spread out slightly, pretending to look at the shelves, but always keeping their eyes on her. The shopkeeper only laughed, clearly pleased that trouble was brewing. "Be careful, human," he said mockingly. "Not all eyes in this city look kindly at strangers protecting worthless things." Daniel ignored him. He bent slightly, speaking softly to Lyra. "Stay close. Do not let go." She could not understand the words, but she felt the firmness in his tone. She nodded quickly, pressing herself against him, as if she feared the ground itself would take her away if she stepped aside. Daniel led her to another corner of the shop and picked out more clothes, something thicker, a cloak to cover her glowing skin and tangled hair. He handed it to her, and she pulled it tightly around her shoulders. The men continued to watch, their whispers growing sharper. One of them finally laughed aloud, spitting a word Daniel did not know but understood in his bones. A word that meant slave. Daniel's jaw locked. He placed the rest of his credits on the counter, grabbed the bundle of clothes, and walked to the door with Lyra. The shopkeeper chuckled as he scooped up the money, calling after him, "Clothes will not change what she is, human." Daniel didn't look back. The street outside was crowded, filled with merchants shouting their prices, smoke rising from food stalls, and the constant noise of bargaining. But Daniel felt the danger immediately. The men from the shop were behind them, blending with the crowd but never far away. Lyra stayed pressed to his side, her fingers gripping his arm so tightly it almost hurt. Her eyes darted in every direction, her breath fast and shallow. They passed a row of stalls selling fruit and spices, the air heavy with strange smells. Daniel stopped briefly to buy a small loaf of bread, handing it to Lyra. She bit into it hungrily, her eyes softening for a brief moment. But her gaze quickly flicked back to the crowd. The men were still there, moving when they moved, waiting for the right moment. Daniel guided her through winding alleys, trying to lose them. But the city was a maze, and the men were skilled. At every turn, he felt their shadows. His hand brushed the empty space at his side where his knife should have been. Lost to the river, he cursed silently. He was unarmed, in a city that wanted to swallow them whole. Lyra tugged his arm suddenly, pulling him toward a small square. There, musicians played strange instruments, and children ran between the stalls. For a moment, it felt normal, almost safe. But when Daniel looked up, he caught sight of the hunters again. They stood at the edge of the square, their eyes fixed on him, waiting. Lyra's hand trembled in his. She looked up at him, her lips parting. Her voice came out weak, almost broken, but the word was clear. "Safe?" she whispered, as if asking if his promise still stood. Daniel met her glowing eyes, his chest heavy. He squeezed her hand firmly and nodded. "Yes," he whispered back, though he knew the truth was more dangerous than ever. He would keep her safe, but it would not be easy. The men were closing in, and soon he would have to make a choice: fight without weapons or find another way to protect her. The city around them buzzed with life, unaware of the quiet battle about to unfold. Daniel stood tall, his heart steady. He had given her clothes, dignity, and hope. Now he would have to give her safety, no matter the cost. And the men watching them would soon learn that the human they followed was not as weak as they believed. The square was alive with noise, music drifting in the air, merchants calling out their prices, and children laughing as they ran between stalls. But Daniel heard none of it. His eyes stayed on the men at the edge of the square, their gazes sharp and fixed on Lyra. They did not move quickly. They were patient hunters. They followed in the open, confident no one would stop them. In this city, people looked away from cruelty. Daniel knew it. Lyra knew it. And that was why her hand trembled so badly in his. Daniel guided her through the crowd, trying to blend in. He pulled her cloak tighter over her glowing eyes and wild hair, but no matter how much he tried to hide her, she stood out. She moved differently. She was too thin, too alert, too frightened. Eyes followed them wherever they went, and every stare felt like a knife at Daniel's back. They turned into a narrow street. Here, the noise of the market faded. The walls rose high on either side, and shadows filled the corners. Lyra tugged at his arm, her glowing eyes nervous, as if she sensed what was coming. Daniel's stomach turned heavy. He already knew. The men had chosen this place. Footsteps echoed behind them. Slow, steady, purposeful. Daniel stopped and turned. 3 of them stepped out from the street's mouth, blocking the exit. Another pair came from the other end, cutting off escape. Lyra gasped softly and clung to Daniel's side. She did not cry, but her body shook as though she already knew her fate if they took her. One of the men smirked and spoke in a language Daniel barely understood. But the meaning was clear from the way he gestured at Lyra. Property. They thought she belonged to them, or at least to the cages of the market. The man reached for her. Daniel stepped forward, blocking the hand. His voice came out steady, though his heart raced. "She is not yours." The men laughed. One spat on the ground, then drew a short blade from his belt. The others followed, each holding weapons, knives, clubs, crude but deadly. Lyra's breath caught. Her hand gripped Daniel's arm tightly, almost painfully. Her glowing eyes searched his face, desperate, afraid, but full of trust. Daniel felt her silent question. Would he leave her? Would he run to save himself? He met her eyes and shook his head slowly. He would not. The men closed in. Daniel's eyes darted between them, his body tense. He had no weapon but his fists, no armor but his own skin. But he stood tall, keeping himself between them and Lyra. His voice came out calm, strong enough for her to hear. "Stay behind me." The first man lunged. Daniel sidestepped, grabbing his wrist and slamming it into the wall. The knife clattered to the ground. Pain shot through Daniel's arm as another swung a club, the heavy wood grazing his shoulder. He staggered but stayed upright, shoving the first attacker back with all his strength. The alley exploded with noise. Blades flashing, boots scraping stone, the clash of men trying to drag one girl away. Daniel fought with every ounce of strength he had. His fists cracked against faces, his elbows slammed into ribs. He took blows too. A cut opened across his arm, blood trickling down. His jaw throbbed where a fist struck him. But each time he fell back, he rose again. Behind him, Lyra pressed against the wall, her hands over her mouth to keep from screaming. Her glowing eyes never left him. She watched as he fought like no one had ever fought for her before. Not as prey, not as property, but as if she mattered more than his own life. One man grabbed Daniel from behind, arms locking around his chest. Another rushed forward to strike. Daniel twisted, dragging the man holding him into the path of the blade. The attacker froze too late. The knife sank into his own ally's side. The man dropped, screaming. Daniel tore free, his breath ragged, his eyes burning with fury. 2 remained standing. They hesitated now, their smirks gone, their confidence shaken. Daniel's shirt clung to his skin with sweat and blood, but his stance did not break. He raised his fists again, daring them. "Come on," he growled. For a long moment, the men only stared. Then, realizing the fight was no longer in their favor, they cursed and backed away. They spat words at him, promising this was not the end, then disappeared into the shadows, dragging the wounded with them. Silence fell in the alley. Daniel's chest heaved, every breath sharp with pain. His body ached, cuts burning, but he was still standing. He turned slowly, his eyes finding Lyra. She stood frozen, her hands trembling, her glowing eyes wide with something more than fear. She rushed to him, her thin hands pressing against his bleeding arm, her face full of worry. She whispered something broken in her own tongue, words he could not understand. But her tone was clear. She was afraid for him, not herself. Daniel placed his hand over hers, steadying her. "I'm fine," he said softly, even though he was not. She shook her head quickly, tears shining in her eyes, but her lips formed one word she had learned. "Safe," she whispered. Daniel froze. The word was not a question this time. It was a statement. To her, he was safe. Daniel swallowed hard, his chest tight. He had fought before in other places for other reasons, but this was different. He had no duty here, no orders, no mission. He had only a choice, and he had chosen her. He wrapped the cloak tighter around her, hiding her from the world outside the alley. His voice was steady again. "We move," he said. She nodded quickly, her hand still gripping his arm. They stepped out of the alley, back into the noisy city streets. The music played, merchants shouted, and people bargained as if nothing had happened. But to Lyra, everything had changed. She looked up at him with eyes no longer only afraid. There was something else now, hope, and to Daniel, that single look made every wound worth it. The city streets buzzed with noise, but Daniel and Lyra walked in silence. Every step Daniel took burned with pain. His arms were cut, his jaw swollen, his body bruised. Yet he moved forward without slowing. Lyra stayed close, her hand never leaving his arm. She glanced around nervously, pulling her cloak tighter, but her glowing eyes kept lifting to him, full of something new, trust. He had fought for her, bled for her, and in her heart that meant more than words. But the danger was not gone. As they turned a corner, a sound froze them in place. Heavy boots striking stone, the clatter of armor. A squad of soldiers marched into view, their weapons gleaming under the torchlight. Their leader, taller than the rest, raised a hand, signaling them to stop. His sharp eyes landed on Lyra immediately. He pointed, his voice booming through the street. "That girl, she is property of the market. Return her at once." Lyra stiffened, her body trembling. Her hand squeezed Daniel's arm so tightly her nails dug into his skin. She whispered one broken word, almost too soft to hear. "No." Daniel felt her fear, but more than that, he felt her plea. She did not want to go back. Not now. Not ever. Daniel stepped forward, his body aching but his stance unbroken. He placed himself between Lyra and the soldiers, his voice firm. "She is not property. She is free." The soldiers exchanged looks, then laughter rippled through their ranks. The leader sneered. "A human speaks of freedom? Do not insult us. Move aside, or we will take her by force." The crowd around them began to gather. Traders, shoppers, and beggars all stopped to watch. Whispers spread quickly. Some pointed at Lyra, calling her wild, unworthy. Others stared at Daniel in disbelief. A human daring to stand against soldiers in a foreign city? Madness. Yet Daniel did not move, his hands curled into fists, his eyes never leaving the leader. The soldiers began to advance. Lyra's breath came fast, her eyes darting from the soldiers to Daniel. She looked terrified, but still pressed herself against his back, as though hiding behind him could keep the whole world away. Daniel felt her trembling, and it filled him with fire. He could not let them take her. The leader stopped only a few paces away. His blade scraped against the ground as he dragged it lazily, showing off his power. "Step aside, human. Last warning." Daniel's jaw tightened. His voice came out low but steady. "No." The word hit like a stone in the silence. The crowd gasped. The soldiers blinked, surprised by his defiance. The leader snarled, "Then you die with her." He raised his blade. Daniel's heart pounded, but he did not step back. He spread his arms slightly, shielding Lyra. He had no weapon, no strength left to fight so many. But still, he stood. His bloodied body, his ragged clothes, his steady gaze. Everything about him screamed one truth. He would not let her be taken, even if it meant his end. For a long moment, the soldiers hesitated. Something about his stance, about the fire in his eyes, unsettled them. He was just a human, weaker than them, but he stood as if nothing in the galaxy could move him. The crowd grew restless, whispers spreading like fire. The human, he defies them. Is he mad? Or brave? Lyra slowly lifted her head from behind him. Her glowing eyes locked on the soldiers, and for the first time there was no fear in them. Only belief. She pressed her forehead lightly against his back and whispered the word again, soft but clear. Safe. That single word carried through the silence, cutting sharper than any blade. The crowd murmured louder. The soldiers looked uneasy. The leader gritted his teeth, lifting his weapon higher, but something had shifted. The human's defiance had planted doubt. A voice rose from the crowd. An old merchant shouted, "Let them go! She is no property." Another joined, then another. The whispers turned into voices, voices into shouts. The people, who had once only looked away, now sided with the human. Not out of kindness for Lyra, but because one man's courage had reminded them that chains could be broken. The soldiers faltered under the growing noise. The leader's face twisted in anger, but he could feel the weight of the crowd pressing in. To take the girl now would mean a riot, blood spilled in the streets, chaos he could not control. He spat on the ground, glaring at Daniel. "This is not over, human." With a sharp signal, the soldiers turned and marched away, their armor clattering, their threat lingering in the air. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others whispering in awe. Daniel barely heard them. His knees shook, his body screamed with pain, but he stayed upright. Lyra stepped around him, her glowing eyes fixed on his face. She reached up with her thin hand, touching his cheek gently, her lips trembling. Tears slid down her dirt-streaked skin, but her smile was soft, filled with something he had not seen before. Hope. Daniel covered her hand with his own, his chest heavy with exhaustion, but full of something stronger. He had not saved her completely. The danger was not gone. But in that moment, in that stand, he had given her something greater than safety. He had given her freedom. The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving them standing together in the fading torchlight. Daniel wrapped the cloak tighter around her shoulders, guiding her away from the square. Lyra walked beside him, not trembling now, but steady. She stayed close, her hand in his, her head high. As they disappeared into the city's winding streets, the whispers of the people followed them. The human who defied the soldiers. The wild girl who found her protector. And though Daniel knew the fight was far from finished, he also knew one thing with certainty. He would never let her go back to chains. No matter how many beasts, men, or soldiers stood in their way, he would stand before them all. Because in her eyes, in that single word she had given him, he had found something worth more than his own life. Safe.